So let's start here with the corner. The corner of 38th and Chicago Avenue South, Minneapolis, Minnesota, where it happened. That's where it happened. That's where a 17-year-old named Darnella Frazier pointed her phone camera and held it steady. And by holding it steady, she held the world accountable. You know that story. You know it all over the black world. And as it turns out, over every other world that there is as well. George Perry Floyd Jr. was murdered on May 25, 2020. Derek Chauvin, a veteran Minneapolis police officer, knelt on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. 3 other police officers looked on. Bystanders who tried to intervene were pushed back. Floyd called out for his mother. He told the officers he could not breathe, and he died. Within hours, the video was everywhere. Within days, the streets were full, and within 2 weeks, something happened that I had not seen in 50 years of covering this community, this city, this country. The world moved, not just in solidarity with us, not just in sympathy. The world moved because they recognized themselves in that image. They recognized their own corners, their own dead, their own centuries of unfinished business. That's how close it is. Minneapolis, Minnesota, a city that had barely been heard of outside of Prince and the Vikings, became the place where a global reckoning was born. The protests began hours after the murder, right here at 38th and Chicago. They spread through Minneapolis, through St. Paul, through the metro. The 3rd Precinct was burned. The Minnesota National Guard was activated in its largest deployment since World War II. The destruction, estimated at $550 million across 1,500 locations, made Twin Cities the site of the second most destructive period of civil unrest in American history after the 1992 Los Angeles uprising. But our fire lit fires everywhere. In Washington, D.C., Mayor Muriel Bowser had the words "Black Lives Matter" painted on in enormous yellow letters on the street in front of the White House. In Rio de Janeiro, hundreds took to the street in defense of black lives in the favelas, and when police met them with tear gas, the protesters answered back with Floyd's own words, "I can't breathe." In Colombia, Floyd's killing arrived bookended by murders of black men at home. Anderson Arboleda, a 19-year-old Afro-Colombian, had been beaten by Colombian police on May 19, 2020, 6 days before George Floyd died, for allegedly violating coronavirus curfew restrictions. He died 2 days later from severe head trauma. Protesters marched to the U.S. Embassy in Bogota. Their grief doubled. In September 2020, Javier Ordóñez died after being brutalized in police custody. The video shows him pleading, "Enough, no more, please." And the protests that followed turned deadly when police cracked down. A UN-backed report later categorized the deaths of 11 victims during those protests as a massacre by Colombian police. In Mexico City, portraits of Floyd were hung on the fence outside the U.S. Embassy alongside flowers, candles, and signs reading, "Racism kills," here, there, and all over the world. That's the truth. That's the whole truth. In Bristol, England, protesters did what civic officials had refused to do for decades. They pulled down the statue of Edward Colston, a 17th century slave trader whose name still graced concert halls and pubs in the very city he helped to build on the trafficking of over 84,000 West African men, women, and children. And they threw it into the harbor where his ships had once docked, right into the water. In Brussels, Belgium, demonstrators climbed the statue of King Leopold II, who presided over one of the most brutal colonial regimes in African history, in the Congo, and they waved the Congolese flag. In Oxford, students renewed their campaign against the statue of Cecil Rhodes. In London, the statue of Winston Churchill was spray painted. Within days, what had began as 20 people standing outside the embassy grew to more than 20,000 people flooding the streets. A British activist, Timmy Mwali from the Fourth Front Project, said what needed to be said. Mwali said, "We have many George Floyds." She named Rashawn Charles and Edson da Costa, two black men who died after being restrained by London police in 2017, names that many in the outraged crowds did not know. She was not diminishing Floyd, she was expanding the frame. In Paris, the government banned demonstrations near the U.S. Embassy and the Eiffel Tower out of concern for what they knew was coming. It came anyway. Thousands marched behind Assa Traoré, the sister of Adama Traoré, a 24-year-old who died in French police custody in 2016 after being restrained, a case in which no one was ever charged. We demand justice, not conversation, Assa Traoré said. That is a sentence you could have said in Minneapolis. That sentence still belongs to all of us. In Germany, rallies filled Frankfurt and Berlin. In Copenhagen, chants of no justice, no peace rose outside the Danish capital's U.S. Embassy. In Dublin, an Irish marcher named Anna Harrivan put it simply: the protest was a show of solidarity with our friends in the U.S., but also a united stand against endemic racism, which is a global threat. The African Union condemned the murder of George Floyd. That matters. And it was far too little and far too late. An African scholar writing in those days put it plainly: his death was the latest in a long line of killings of black men, women, and children that had drawn no official response from the continent over the years, despite commitments to ending racial discrimination. As a continent, he wrote, we have failed our African American brothers and sisters, offering next to nothing in the way of meaningful solidarity to ensure their dignity. This is our shame. That's a hard thing to say, but it's also a necessary thing to say. The same spirit that animated Marcus Garvey, that ran through the veins of Pan-Africanism from Du Bois to Nkrumah to Lumumba, teaches us that black dignity anywhere is connected to black dignity everywhere. You cannot separate them. You cannot have one without the other. In Nigeria, the murder of George Floyd accelerated a movement already building against the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. They call it SARS, S-A-R-S, a notorious police unit with a long record of harassment, extortion, and killings of civilians, particularly young Nigerians. The End SARS movement, which had been percolating for years, erupted. Young Nigerians brought key roads to a standstill in Lagos and other cities, connecting their own struggles to Floyd's. They were not borrowing someone else's movement. They were declaring that the same disease had taken root in their streets. In Kenya, murals appeared in Kibera documenting police violence against protesters outside the Parliament building in Nairobi. Demonstrators gathered against the state's brutalizing of its own citizens. In South Africa, protests gathered outside the U.S. Embassy in Cape Town, even as activists in Pretoria were marching against the death of Collins Khoza, beaten by South African security forces enforcing a COVID lockdown. The U.S. ambassador to Zimbabwe at that time, Brian A. Nichols, who is African American, dropped the diplomatic language and spoke as himself. He said, as an African American, for as long as I can remember, I have known that my rights and my body were not fully my own. He went on, he said that he had dedicated his life to America's service because he believed in what America aspired to be. The Zimbabwean government, which had been under American pressure over human rights violations, heard the statement and understood the reckoning had made its way even to the offices of diplomacy. That is what George Floyd's death did. It stripped away the cover. It made hypocrisy visible in capitals that had been comfortable hiding behind it. In South Korea, protesters held solidarity marches in Seoul, connecting George Floyd's death to ongoing conversations about racism in Korean society. The U.S. Embassy in Seoul hung a large Black Lives Matter banner in front of its building, an act that would have been unimaginable weeks before. In Japan, protests gathered in Osaka. In Hong Kong, demonstrators rallied outside the U.S. consulate. In Australia, A rally planned at Sydney's Hyde Park met resistance from the government, with Prime Minister Scott Morrison declaring that there was no need to import what was happening in the United States. The people disagreed. Thousands defied government calls to stay home from the overrepresentation, stay home, and marched in Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, and Perth, protesting both George Floyd's murder and the overrepresentation of Indigenous Australians in their own criminal justice system. And they were not importing anything, they were naming what already was theirs to name. In New Zealand, a country that carries a global reputation for peace and tolerance, black activists used the moment to speak about what they called a state of complete denial about problems at home. In Syria, two artists in the Idlib province painted a mural of George Floyd in the rubble of a war-torn town. In the rubble. Think about that. Even Iran, hardly an American ally, entered the conversation. Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif took Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's own language condemning Iranian policies and redirected it, posting, "It's long overdue for the entire world to wage war against racism." The irony was not lost on anyone. The hypocrisy of American exceptionalism was on full display, and governments that had been lectured about human rights now had the standing to point back. What it means and what it demands. I've been in community journalism for more than 50 years. I have covered the aftermath of assassinations, the quiet grinding down of everyday black life in this city, in this state, in this country. I've seen moments that looked like the turning points, but then were not. This one was different. Not because the outrage was new. The outrage was not new. George Floyd's murder was not the first. It was not even close to the first recorded murder of a black man by American police. It was different. What was different was Darnella Frazier's camera. What was different was that a 17-year-old black girl stood her ground and kept recording. What was different was that the world watched and the world recognized itself. From Lagos to London, from Bogota to Brussels, from Sydney to Seoul, people looked at that video and they saw the same thing. They saw what colonialism looks like when it keeps going. They saw what happens when power is never fully held accountable. They saw their own dead. They said his name, they say his name, and they say the names that they have been carrying. That's how close it is. Minneapolis sits at the center of a global story. George Floyd Square, 38th in Chicago, where I stand right now, is a sacred site, not because we made it one, but because the world made it one. Because people in countries that Minnesotans could not find on a map looked at that corner and said, the world, the corner, belongs to us too. So we're in year 6 of this reckoning. The question is not whether the world reacted. The world did react. The only question that matters now is whether those reactions built anything lasting. Whether the statues that fell made room for something true. Whether the pledges that came became policy. Whether the people who took to the streets on every continent, in every language, calling for justice, whether they are still calling, whether we are answering. George Floyd's daughter, Gianna, told President Biden, "Daddy changed the world." She was 6 years old. She was right. The world did change. The harder question is, changed into what? I'm Al McFarland.